use the chat bar on the side as we discussed. We're going to dive in here to some blood sugar regulation, intermittent fasting, how that translates into other hormones. And we are going to be talking about probably on our next week's thing, we'll probably be talking a lot about thyroid. So I haven't talked with Dr. Warner yet about that, Dr. Mike, but we're probably going to we'll probably chat about thyroid next time. So
I know a lot of you have asked about electromagnetic frequencies, EMF.
That'll be coming up as well
the next week. So
yeah. So bottom line, blood sugar. Let's dive in. Mike, Dr. Mike, I want you chiming in. We're gonna interrupt each other and just beat this one up a little bit. But blood sugar regulation is critical, and it's actually one of those risk factors for COVID. So it is somewhat timely in that response as well. But when we have altered blood sugar handling, but when it comes to blood glucose, when you eat food, your food is broken down and glucose is one of those pieces that remains. And glucose, when it comes into the body, there's a hormone response that gets driven. The pancreas, a gland sitting deep in your abdomen here, releases a couple of hormones as a response to blood glucose or glucose going into the bloodstream. And one of the main ones that we're going to discuss here is insulin. Insulin recognizes that there is sugar now in the blood and it needs to figure out what to do with that. So there are receptors that are present on lots of different spots in the body, but in the fat cells, skeletal muscle, like your biceps and quadriceps, things like that, and then also liver. There are these insulin receptors there. So insulin will bind to receptors and it will then start to put the sugar that's in the blood into some different spots, because we can't have the glucose level in the blood rise too high. It's a very closely regulated thing, just like every other system in the body. Homeostasis is what it's looking for, and it has to be very tightly regulated, or the body does not respond well. And disease or dis-ease, as we oftentimes say in the chiropractic world, can develop as a result of that. So insulin has a job. It has to get blood glucose brought back down, and it will then store. Sorry, this is.
Guys, I'll hit the admit button. That helps, so you don't have to keep doing it too.
Yeah, dinging. It's good though. I love that people are adding on. It's awesome. Yeah. So we're just starting to talk through blood sugar dynamics here, and it gets complex, but there's a lot of nutrients that are required as well for this to be happening correctly, and the body can store a certain amount of blood glucose, and it does that in glycogen stores. Okay, so glucagon is another hormone that will release glycogen stores, but sugar gets stored in the liver in the form of glycogen, and that's a quick release, quick energy that the body can use. There's only so much glycogen that can be stored in the body, and so that extra glucose that can't be turned into glycogen then gets stored in the form of triglycerides, really, is the main source of that. So if you guys have had a cholesterol panel run, you'll see triglycerides there. And in my world of functional medicine, if I'm seeing somebody's triglycerides being elevated, my mind automatically starts to go to, is there some sort of dysglycemia or dysregulation within the blood sugar? Okay, and there's a lot of other markers that should be run. Classically, we'll get a blood glucose, and it's a fasting level where we get, our blood drawn, or we do a finger stick, and we can see that exact second how much glucose is present in the blood. And that's a really helpful marker to know for that moment at that time. Typical labs will use a range of 65 to 99 for that. In a functional medicine world, optimally, we're typically looking for 75 to 85 roughly. You know, if you're sitting there at 98, you're lab normal, but, you know, you're right on the cusp. And when I look at lab markers, one of the things that we try to do at the clinic is, you know, we've got a large range for some of these different labs, and they've been established as the normal, and that's fine. But if you go above 99, some will say you've got prediabetes at that point. And if that's the case, if I'm at 98, there's not a whole lot of guardrail available before I'm falling off the cliff. So I always tell patients, you know, we've got a cliff on one side, and if I'm on the road, I want to have a guardrail, I want to have a shoulder, I want to have a rumble strip before I ever fall off the side of that cliff. You know, that
the cliff being a disease state.
The disease state, you know, because diabetes, being type 2 diabetes, I'm going to mention here, it's truly a lifestyle disease. It's something that is, it sounds harsh, but it's something that's honestly chosen by our lifestyle and some of the decisions that we make. Type 2 diabetes is. And so when we have blood sugar dysregulation, we need to be looking at a number of different things. But these triglycerides I was mentioning that we see on cholesterol panel can start to be an indication of, hey, there's been a lot of glucose hanging around, and the glycogen stores have probably been filled up, and now we're starting to see the triglyceride levels elevate as well, which can be a problem, okay? And so when we're talking with our doctors, whoever, because I know there's people all the way from Iowa on this call, and I don't know where else, but you know, when we're talking with our doctors, we need to be looking at a lot of different blood markers. Not, you know, our blood glucose is great, triglycerides are great, but also understanding things like a hemoglobin A1c, which is looking at what has your blood sugar been doing over the last 90 days, roughly. That can be a really helpful marker. And oftentimes I'll order, it's called a hemoglobin A1c with a glycomark, and that'll also be showing if we're getting big spikes, oftentimes with blood sugar in the course of our day. C-peptide and insulin can also be tested in the blood. If you're in a fasting state, which we're going to be talking a lot about here in a moment, if we're in a fasting state where we haven't eaten, our insulin levels should be low. Because once again, insulin is coming into the system based off of glucose coming into the blood from the food that we eat. If we don't have glucose coming into the blood, our insulin levels should be low. So think of that when it comes to some of these things. Insulin is a storage hormone. It's storing extra glucose. It's telling the body what to do with extra glucose. It's a tightly controlled mechanism. And Dr. Warner, what would you add into that whole scenario?
No, that was a good general summary of everything. I mean, I wouldn't say anything else. I mean, there's obviously all other regulatory things. Your kidneys have a factor in you know, excreting excess sugar when the glucose. And when you taste sugar, we're primarily talking about glucose, because that plays into, you know, you talk about sugar. Sugars are complex carbohydrates, etc. But we're primarily in the body. Everything gets converted down, broken down to a simple sugar called glucose for the most part. Fructose is another simple sugar, but that's from your fruit sugars, and maybe Ashley can talk a little bit about that too. But yeah, certainly the standard is keeping your blood sugar absolutely the cutoff, like you're talking about, less than 100. There's that little gray zone between 100 and 125, and it goes above 125 is diabetes until proven otherwise, and that's typically diabetes type 2. Diabetes type 1 is definitely more of a genetic, and that's just a lack of insulin. So we're leaving that out of the discussion today altogether, because that's not really what the realm here is, you know?
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think maybe it might be helpful to just explain the HbA1c lab ranges a little bit more in depth than what we look at from, you know, functional and integrated medicine for that 3-month roughly window.
Yeah. So I think the lab range typically is 4.8 to 5.7 for normal, I believe. Or
Yes, yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
Yeah, so 4.8 to 5.7 is normal, and then 5.7 to I think 6.4 is pre-diabetes, and above 6.4 is diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once again, me being picky, when I'm looking at things, I'm looking for it generally in that 5 to 5.2 realm, because for me, once again, 5.6, what's the difference between 5.6, 5.7? It's 0.1. And, if kind of the writing's on the wall a little bit that we're trending towards a dysglycemic state potentially if that's going on. So I get pickier and I'm looking for that being lower. C-peptide, I mentioned, C-peptide and insulin are made in a 1-to-1 ratio from the same precursor in the body. Insulin can be a bit unstable in the blood to test. C-peptide seems to be a more stable marker, which can give a little bit more of an accurate description of what's happening with insulin. If somebody's in a fasting state and their body is really sensitive to insulin, I would expect a C-peptide to be in like a 1.3 to 1.6 range, which is lower, once again, on the scale of what is lab normal for C-peptide. But if we're fasting, insulin should be low. So that's kind of lab markers 101 on a couple of the big things to look at. So.
Yeah. So it's helpful to get an idea of blood sugar physiology. That was a 50,000-foot view. There's obviously a lot more that goes into it, like Dr. Mike mentioned as well, but kind of good to frame things like discussing fasting and hormones with, what actually is happening from a blood sugar standpoint within the body. So should we jump into intermittent fasting, or do we want to?
Once again, throw some questions on the side as we're going along, or if we need to. I'm not saying we'll get to them right this second, but I think we can dive into some fasting topics.
Okay. So intermittent fasting.
Ashley, does everybody understand the difference between, triglycerides, free fatty acids? I mean, we always talk about that. Like you talked a little bit about it too. And like Kevin talked a little bit there too. I mean, certainly when we talk fats in the body, there are different forms, but for the most part, triglycerides are the things that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Triglycerides get broken down into free fatty acids, and we'll talk a little bit about that during the fasting state, like you're talking about. Yeah. But the other interesting thing when you're talking, and just so that they can wrap their minds around this, when you do the cholesterol profile, your LDLs and the VLDLs are part of the cholesterol moiety, the little fractions, and those are dependent on what the triglycerides are. So, we're talking a little bit about some of the other pieces, but when your sugar is high, your triglycerides go up, and then what happens is your LDLs and VLDLs go up, which are really the atherogenic types of things that really can cause problems with heart disease, et cetera. So just to kind of circumvent that a little bit with what you guys are saying, so you can kind of get a little bit other picture. Okay. And
it might be, obvious, but we have the ability to run all of these labs at our clinic. Both of our docs are completely well-versed and obviously in what these lab markers mean, and we run them on a daily basis. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I have no idea what my blood glucose is or my HbA1c, reach out to us. We can be of help for that. So as we transition into intermittent fasting, there's a broad spectrum of what intermittent fasting might be. And for simplicity's sake, I want to talk about two specific kind of ways to intermittent fast, and then we'll get into some of the benefits and all the wonderful things that the therapeutic things that it can happen on the body. So two types of intermittent fasting. One would be time-restricted eating. The other would be like a whole day fast. So really, intermittent fasting is closing your eating window, so to speak. So especially the time-restricted eating, it is really just condensing the periods of time that you're eating and consuming food to a shorter amount of time. And then conversely, whole day fast would be a 24-hour or even more ideal, like a 36-hour fast, like dinner and then go the whole next day, and then maybe, start with breakfast or lunch the following day. So whole day fast, pretty self-explanatory, and then time restricted eating. And we're going to get into like how to transition to these various things, but I'll just say, I'll give you my example. I pretty much use time restricted eating and sometimes whole day fast is just a part of my lifestyle. So for me, this looks like I eat my breakfast/lunch around 11 o'clock or noon, and I eat my dinner around 6 p.m. and that's what I do. Maybe I'll have a snack in there, but that window of eating has become much smaller. You think about our ancestors, and we really quite recently in our calendar, we've started to eat several meals a day plus snacks. And that's really kind of the health and nutrition advice that we've been given for so long, is you need to keep your blood sugar stable. You need to be eating frequently, eating all these small meals. And the reality is, it's before the Industrial Revolution, especially, we ate 1 to 2 meals a day, and we weren't constantly snacking. And even if we had 3 meals a day, there was typically at least a good 12 hours between our dinner, our overnight, and our sleep, and then our breakfast the next day. So, little bit about that right now. I want to get into some of the benefits of intermittent fasting. So obviously weight loss is going to be a benefit. Weight loss is probably the #1 benefit of intermittent fasting. And this works with a couple mechanisms here, because intermittent fasting increases norepinephrine, and when that's a neurotransmitter. And so when that level is raised, it helps the body burn fat and be in a weight loss state. So when you fast, we're talking about, glucose and, all the receptor sites. I mean, there's glucose receptors on every cell in the body. We go from a glucose burning state to a fat burning state. And really, those are the 2 main fuels that you have to survive on. So if you are constantly eating, you're always going to have a glucose level to some extent. And so when you're constantly eating, you're just going to be burning sugar. But again, when we, and that part of that's because we have insulin as a direct cause of that, and then it's a storage hormone, and it just is really hard to get on top of that unless you're fasting. So that norepinephrine helps us switch to a fat burning weight loss state. And again, like we were talking about the triglycerides, so that is really usually like it's burned as energy. So it's a really beautiful
they start to get broken down into, a lot of you have probably heard of ketones and the ketogenic diet, things like that. But think of the body as like a hybrid engine. It's got 2 fuel sources that it could run on if it wants to, glucose or ketones. 99% of us are running on glucose all the time, or the gas, and you might have a battery pack in the trunk that you could use, but you never ever use it. And this is essentially like making your body metabolically flexible so it can run on glucose or ketones, the fats that get broken down more easily. Your body can transition and be utilizing.
And that's really what you want. You want to be able to transition seamlessly and really well, because the chief goal is eat a meal and transition right back, so you're not in this hyperglycemic sugar burning state. So that switch from fat burning or sugar burning to fat burning starts around the 10-hour mark. Now you think about this, so you go to bed, and most of us have that 10-hour window. A lot of us snack throughout the night, or have a bedtime snack, and then you get up and you eat breakfast. You are just starting to make that switch at the 10-hour mark, and really more toward it kind of peaks and gets the most efficient at the 18-hour mark. So that is just something to keep in mind, and not everyone's going to be able to jump in and do an 18-hour fast right away, and that's fine. But keep that in mind as you're thinking, for us, the absolute minimum that anybody should have a fast is at least 12 hours, 12 to 14 hours. But obviously, the longer you get, more metabolic benefit.
So, and one of the things that I will say, and I'm sure Dr. Mike is going to probably talk a little bit about this too, but fasting is not for everybody right away. Okay. You don't just jump into a 36-hour fast necessarily, and you should talk with your doctors about some of those things, because there are times where fasting is not at all appropriate. For most people, it is completely appropriate and safe and arguably should be practiced, but there are instances where we shouldn't do that, and we can certainly discuss that here as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I'll just chime in. I mean, you know, we all know that when we do blood work, what do we always say? You got to do a fasting blood test, and that fasting test, just like Dr. Asher said, should be at least 12 hours. So it gives you a truer reading of what your basal blood glucose is. And in that light, with what you just said, you know, people with eating disorders absolutely should never try and do fasting. Okay. People with significant hypothyroidism, since we'll talk about that next week, is something else. People with diabetes that are on medications, especially oral medications, absolutely no, unless you're talking to me, and we are going to make some adaptations to that kind of thing. So just like you're saying, you know, always, there is no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to your health. And I always want our patients to always know that, you know, whether it's, you know, at the time of an office visit or on these types of things, or, you know, even a phone call or a telemedicine, something, we're available for people. And, you know, ask me the dumb questions. That's the easier ones to answer. It's the tough ones that are, you know, a different thing altogether. So I just want you to always know that communication line is open. And that's some of the frustration that people get, is when they go to their doctor said, oh yeah, your cholesterol is fine, and, you know, don't worry about it, and they move on. And because they may not have time, I think it's important that people know that, you know, we are all going to sit down, we're going to break that stuff down, just like Kevin said, and be a little bit more rigorous, because we want to make sure people maintain their health. So even though the guideline says, oh yeah, your fasting blood sugar is 106 and your A1c is 6.2, so you're not diabetic, okay, but just watch your sugars and then go home. Well, that's not adequate. So anyway, just always be aware that you can come and talk to us, so we know if it is appropriate for you. Yeah. And like you're talking, Ashley, there are different types of fasting. And, you know, one of our big things is always a circadian thing. Since we talked about circadian rhythms last week, how that ties into your body's circadian rhythm is really very interesting.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's jump into that, because that is one of the benefits of intermittent fasting, is improved circadian rhythm. You think of circadian rhythm just being your sleep-wake cycle, but there's a lot more involved with your circadian rhythm. You know, so we're designed to eat during the day, during the light cycle, and then, you know, sleep and rest at night during the dark cycle. But eating at night, like we talked about before, totally disrupts our cascades of sleep hormones and our circadian rhythm. So, you know, eating during a specific window really can help us metabolically, and then therefore help inadvertently the circadian rhythm being our sleep-wake cycle. So other benefits. So improved insulin sensitivity. We've talked about this. We really want to have proper insulin sensitivity for overall blood sugar regulation. So intermittent fasting, like I've said, causes your insulin levels to drop, but at the same time, human growth hormone and norepinephrine rise. We talked about norepinephrine being weight loss, but human growth hormone is also, you know, it's what helps our children grow, but it's also a hormone that, you know, even in the literature, a lot of people look at towards, you know, longevity and your body composition, and a kind of a metabolic hormone, if you will. So again, intimately related to blood sugar. Obviously we eat, insulin levels rise. You know, intermittent fasting has been shown many times in the literature to help prevent and reverse type 2 diabetes. Like Kev said, it's mostly a lifestyle disease.
One of the things, so a doc, his name is Jason Fung. He's a medical doctor up in Canada. He's a nephrologist or a kidney doctor. And so, as Dr. Mike alluded to, you know, blood sugar dysregulation impacts kidneys a lot. So him being a nephrologist, he works with diabetics all day. And he's written a number of different books. I'll show one here. So the Obesity Code. It's a great one. He talks all about fasting all day in this, and it's a great read, I think. He's got another one it's a kind of a more of a user guide, the Complete Guide to Fasting. So those are a couple of things you can put onto your little book list there. The Complete Guide to Fasting really explains some of the physiology of fasting or the behind it and ways to do different fasting too. So if you want, you know, an expanded view of some of what we're talking about here tonight, this might be a great book for you as well. But
we also have a blog post on restorativewellnesscenter.com. It's a couple of years old at this point, and I actually didn't even peek at it today to see if it needed updating. But we do have some other, you know, it's a quicker read, obviously, and free if you're interested in that.
Yeah. So bottom line, you know, when it comes to type 2 diabetes being reversed, like we see that through fasting, and he talks extensively about that and what he does in his clinics, even as far as seeing that reversal occur.
Yeah, I'll concur. The Obesity Code book has become sort of mandatory reading in a lot of nursing schools right now, because of how he breaks things down physiologically as well as the studies. There was a really good study out of University of Alabama that talked just like what Dr. Ashley said. Is they took I forget probably about 500 pre-diabetic males and had them do 8-hour versus 12-hour fasts, and at the end of the study, they were able to show, especially the 8-hour a day eaters as compared to 12-hour a day eaters. They're able to show that the people that ate within that time frame of 8 hours, they didn't feel hungry. Their insulin levels dropped, and their insulin resistance dropped, which is really the key thing behind diabetes is insulin resistance. It's the more insulin you have, the more, I always tell my patients, it's a growth factor. So the more insulin you have, you're going to grow. And unfortunately, you're going to grow in your midsection. The old metabolic syndrome that we always talk about, and it really kind of comes from excess levels of insulin, and that dyslipidemia, elevated blood pressure, abdominal girth distension, etc. So yeah, I just wanted to concur about that, and I think that's a good read for anybody that's interested in this kind of stuff. Yeah,
absolutely,
definitely. Yeah, I mean the research is all out there, and one of the things that he talks about in the Obesity Code a lot is what I find interesting. He's like, there's not one research article out there that supports the move more, eat less is going to lead to weight loss. There's not one peer-reviewed research article out there that supports that as a long-term solution. Move more, eat less. They're important concepts, but it's not what's going to reverse things. It's all about creating that, decreasing the insulin resistance that Dr. Mike was just talking about. That's such the key factor.
Yeah, and it's just important, like overall, we're talking about like type 2 diabetes, like these are chronic disease, and there's so many chronic diseases that are implicated with blood glucose dysregulation. So, you know, kind of going back to those benefits of intermittent fasting, this is a prevention strategy for so many chronic diseases. And we're going to get into hormones even a little bit more, but I do want to just kind of touch on that human growth hormone. As we age, that human growth hormone wanes. Obviously, we're not growing, we don't need to grow, but that is also kind of this hormone that's associated with our body composition and our ability to lose fat. So again, kind of allow when you have the presence of human growth hormone, you are able to lose fat without sacrificing your muscle, and which is another thing. As we age, it's really tricky to keep our lean muscle mass. So the impact on the cellular level for intermittent fasting are just profound. So it is important to note that intermittent fasting is a stressor on the body. In almost all, not almost all, in many circumstances, it is a beneficial stressor. But as Dr. Mike mentioned, if you're hypothyroid, if you have an eating disorder, if you have severe HPA axis dysregulation, meaning your hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis or stress kind of mechanism in your body, if that's way out of whack, intermittent fasting probably isn't your first step here. But it is a good stress in many circumstances. So over time, it makes the body stronger on the cellular level. One of those ways is by initiating autophagy. And autophagy is really kind of the body's process to go in and repair on the cellular level. It kind of eliminates any dysfunctional parts of the cell, and it almost, when you read about like it digests and eliminates, negative pieces of cellular components.
Think of it as the recycling system for the body. It's going to scavenge and take in the things, clean it up.
So, and again, autophagy is really important because it helps prevent from a lot of chronic diseases, as we're talking about, namely, cognitive decline and cancer are two big ones. We want autophagy to be going really well in our body, but it also protects against the negative effects of just oxidative stress and inflammation. We have a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation in our world and our culture. If we're on the planet at this time and place, we're going to be exposed to oxidative stress and inflammation. So again, intermittent fasting helps to kind of buffer those impacts. It also has a really wonderful healing component to the mitochondria. So it helps increase mitochondrial respiration and improves mitochondrial efficiency. And this is really just the furnace of our cells, so to speak. So it really helps, benefit our cellular function. So hopefully you're starting to see, again, mitochondrial function is, if you have impaired mitochondrial function, you're more likely to just succumb to chronic disease, whether it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurocognitive decline, and there's so many there that are implicated. And also it's important to bring up epigenetics and the genetic expression here. So we might have a certain, genetic predisposition, but what we like to say in functional medicine is genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger, which means genes are not your destiny. So
you're not handcuffed to them. Just because, mom, aunt, and someone else had something doesn't mean you necessarily will get it. You might be far more predisposed towards it. However, think of genes almost like light switches. They're going to turn on, turn off based off of environmental factors to an extent, and you might be more predisposed, but it doesn't mean that just because they had it, you will too.
Right. So again, that fasting really can help with the genetic expression, as we say. And I think a really good point to make here is, just talking about the improved brain function that comes from intermittent fasting. So when we are in a fat burning state, that is so clean and lovely for our brains to run on, that fat for fuel rather than glucose. And just a quick example, there's a study, in Finland that was looking at a specific genetic marker, ApoE4, which is, one that's been identified to increase your risk of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and just neurocognitive diseases in general. And again, this intermittent fasting, from your destiny. So, the key here was, this fasting really helped, put these people in a great place for, their genetic expression, so to speak. So
interesting. Things like Alzheimer's in a lot of literature is now starting to be described or called in many instances type 3 diabetes. And so, there's a lot of thought that some dysglycemia or dysregulation within blood sugar can be a really big implication in Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big factors. So
real quick, again, intermittent fasting is wonderful for anti-aging. So calorie, restriction increases our telomeres. So telomeres are sections of DNA that sit on both ends of the chromosomes, and that helps to protect them. So it's thought and research shows that they get shorter when DNA is damaged and as we age. But, really to, lengthen our telomeres, intermittent fasting is a really great strategy for that. And again, shorter telomeres are, again, accelerated aging, various chronic diseases and things like that. And then, gut function. It's important, when we're taking time, digestion is a very metabolically active thing for the body to do. If we're eating all the time, our body that's all it's focusing on is digesting our food, all of our blood's in our gut, and just focusing on that rather than being able to repair and restore the rest of the body. So when we are restricting when we eat, it allows our gut to repair. It helps shift the flora to a better place, lowers inflammation within the gut. And it's important to think about this. Our epithelial cells in our gut replace every 3 days. And really, that's not very long in the grand scheme of things. So, really, that's a pretty quick process. And we want to be able to facilitate that in a really great time frame. So we kind of went through those quickly. There's so many other great benefits, but those are some of the big ones.
Ashley, can I make a couple little quick comments too? That was really good. I thought that was good for a lot of people to recognize. I think let me just go back to one thing about the intermittent the mitochondrial activity. So when you're intermittently fasting and you're converting things, your mitochondria basically is your powerhouse. It's basically where all your energy comes from. Your mitochondria is where your ATP molecule, let's go back to high school biology, right? Okay, so your ATP molecules are the guys that get produced. And, when you're doing this and you're upregulating mitochondrial activity, one of the key things, and you've heard us say this, and I'm just really happy that Ashley did that right there, is she drank some water. If you're not drinking your water, and especially in this day and age with COVID and everything else, you got to recognize that water is part of that stimulator to that whole Krebs cycle within the mitochondria. If you don't have your water, you only make about 2 molecules of ATP per cycle. If you have got your water and your oxygen and you got your fasting and you got your lower insulin levels, then you get making 38 molecules of ATP. So, drink your water, not just because we tell you to do it, but because it really means something. So that's huge. And as you said, fasting is a stress, but it's a physiologic stress. It's a good way to stress your body. When you stress your body, you raise your body's, cortisol levels. You talked a little bit about that, but also your epinephrine from your adrenal gland and the norepinephrine. So the difference is just, we use these terms. Epinephrine is the same thing as what we used to call adrenaline. So people recognize it as that. Norepinephrine is noradrenaline, or basically the adrenaline for the brain. So when you get your epinephrine going or your adrenaline going because of that stress, you get your norepinephrine going, you get your brain active, the brain loads those ketones, it starts to make more nerve cells. There's definitely a lot of studies that say neurogenesis is part of that norepinephrine surge. as well as the increased plasticity to the synapses inside those neurofibers. So not only did you talk about the Alzheimer's connection, here we have another connection here with just increasing, memory loss. I mean, you talk about all those neurodegenerative diseases out there, Parkinson's, Pick's disease, et cetera, that some of them, unfortunately, are associated with genetic things. Just because you get that diagnosis doesn't mean that you have to fall into that category. And this is one of those ways that I think that we're finding maybe exactly how you can increase the telomeres and lower your risk for cancers, obviously, and also lower your risk for these inheritable, like Kevin's, it's a predisposition, doesn't mean it's going to happen. Just like pre-diabetes doesn't mean you're going to get it unless you do something about it in the meantime.
Yeah, exactly. So the how-to for the fasting, I think that's something that, we should discuss a little bit here. So we've talked about shortening the eating window. For a lot of people, that means ditching breakfast. And so the question, and I know it even came up on the chat bar already, is, well, what can I have? If I'm fasting, what is considered a fasting liquid? What am I allowed to drink? Well, water is a definite yes. I will say this. There are some people that talk about doing dry fasts. I personally don't agree with it. I don't get it. I don't think it makes any sense physiologically. There are doctors out there that talk about dry fast, which means absolutely nothing. I don't agree with that.
They say because it just increases autophagy at such a rapid and high rate, but at the same time, your body...
I think it's compromising. The risks don't outweigh the benefits on that one. So bottom line, drink water.
Right.
Water. Okay.
If you feel like you need electrolytes, a small pinch of unrefined salt can be helpful.
Yeah. So a lot of people, are mineral deficient and are electrolyte deficient in different ways too. So one way to get the water to absorb a little bit better might be to put a tiny pinch of some good sea salt into the water. Doesn't have to be a lot. Obviously, you don't want to be drinking the ocean. It's not good for you there. It's not good for you at home either.
It might be worth just saying, make sure you have a clean water source, filtered in some way. You're not exposing yourself to a plethora of toxins as well. Get your tap water looked into if you're concerned about it. Get a water filter.
But fasting liquids would also include things like teas and like black tea, black coffee would all be considered a fasting liquid. Now, a lot of people will talk about bulletproof coffee, where you're actually mixing in things like MCT oil or some grass-fed butter, grass-fed cream to be giving some extra fats, essentially ketones, especially if it's like an MCT oil and you're getting the other fats that are readily available. It depends on how much of a purist you are when it comes to fasting.
I think it's important to mention here, a lot of women, I found really be better to at least start with that bulletproof coffee so that you're hormonally a little bit more even keel as you kind of transition to being metabolically flexible. So a lot of women do really well with having that fat, and it helps them switch over to that fat burning state rather more efficiently. And again, like if you are somebody that has HPA dysregulation, that could be another strategy for you, just so it doesn't kind of overwhelm the body that you're completely calorie restricted. And again, if you're somebody who's just like terrified of going without, it can, again, just kind of be like a little bit of a buffer there, so you're at least getting some calories. So.
But we're not taking away anybody's coffee or tea in the morning here, okay? You're allowed to have that. So, question that just came up on the chat bar as well, and we're going to get there, is, are you allowed to put sweeteners in it? Well, we know that certain sweeteners have obviously a glycemic or a blood glucose raising response in the body. So even, obviously we know that white table sugar is out of the equation. honey, maple syrup, things like that are, more natural sweeteners. They're still off the table for sure because they're going to create a glycemic response in the body. There are some alternative sweeteners that are not supposed to elicit the kind of a blood sugar response. Things like monk fruit or even some of the other sugar alcohols like xylitol and erythritol. They're not shown to create a blood glucose raising response. I still personally would recommend, probably if you can go without that, to go without that, just because there's not tons of research on it, and
it also kind of depends on who you read. Like I'm looking at these books, I'm like, well, he says no, he says yeah, so it kind of depends. I think Funk says no. Like this is another book. Did you talk about?
I didn't talk about it yet.
Mercola Keto Fast. This is a little bit of a different take on fasting, but I think he says you can. So I would say like kind of user caution. And if you really want to get dorky, I've never tried this. Maybe I'll do that this week. I'm going to get a blood glucose, monitor and see how you do. I'll do that this week. We'll report back to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think generally if you can go without the sweetener, it's better. If you are going to use one, something like monk fruit might be a good option because we haven't seen any research showing that it creates a blood sugar raising effect, which would break a fast at that point. Mm-hmm. So that would be probably a good option. But once again, it's really hard to give definitives and 100% scenarios because everybody's different and some people's physiology just responds a little bit differently to some of those pieces. So when it comes to fasting, we talked about water, coffee, tea are all okay. If you need to or want to add in a little bit of those fats, that would be good. When it comes to a sweetener, if you really need it, something like monk fruit might be a good choice. When we come to a mealtime for intermittent fasting, you don't want to sit down to a box of Krispy Kremes, okay? Okay.
Man, she's come on.
But how you break a fast is important. Okay. Mm-hmm. And on an intermittent fast where it's maybe a 12 to 18-hour fast, it's not as big of a deal as like a longer term fast, but it still is important to be thinking through. You don't want to give your body a massive amount of carbohydrate for it to be breaking with. We sit down and we think of what a lot of people's breakfasts are, and it's a big stack of pancakes covered in maple syrup and that whipped cream on top at the restaurant, along with
a big bowl of cereal.
And a big glass of orange juice. I mean, you want to talk about a glucose dump. It's insane. It's absolutely out of this world. And that's why we've got such an incredible prevalence of diabetes in this country. It's staggering. And obesity and everything else they're all tied together with that metabolic syndrome or syndrome X, as it's talked about in a lot of literature.
Yeah, so just if you're going through all this, work to fast, then you're going to eat, junk food in your eating window, while arguably you might have be a little bit better off. You still want to be focusing on your real nutrient dense foods and hopefully for the most part, meals that are going to keep your blood sugar somewhat stable, having, adequate, healthy proteins and healthy fats in that meal to really help you transition into your eating window.
Yeah.
So if you are new to fasting, go ahead, Mike.
No, that's excellent. I think I would agree. The only thing I'll say to you is, we still like to kind of come back to what they call a plant-based Mediterranean style diet in general, because it's just a healthier thing. But yeah, I mean, certainly not going out and overloading yourself with, what did I used to say? I used to always say white flour and rice. Those two carbohydrates are just, anything that's made with that is gonna make your sugars that's basically sucrose, which is 2 molecules of glucose. So you're doubling up your glucose load on your body. So you just be careful with that. I'm going to quickly respond. Somebody made a comment in there about should you try intermittent fasting with breastfeeding or pregnancy? And the answer is really no. Okay, you're in a different physiology altogether at that point. And I think there's actually some studies to say that when you become too ketotic for too long, it may have an impact on the fetal development. So, and what that does is just the opposite, because you have the opposite physiology going on at that time with how the blood flows in and through the uterus. So I'm just going to say that that's not something you should do. And obviously you want to talk to your obstetrician or nurse practitioner, midwife, et cetera, about that. But, again, you're always, during pregnancy, you're always watching your weight and making sure you don't gain too much. And when you switch over to breastfeeding, your prolactin levels are very high, and that has a different hormone altogether that's coming from the pituitary. And kind of like what Dr. Ashley was saying, you don't want to mess with the HPA axis, and the P is pituitary, and that's what you're talking about in that circumstance. So that's not a good idea. Okay.
And probably to piggyback off that, if you are trying to be your most fertile and conceive, you really are going to be focusing on eating a nutrient-dense diet and not, restricting calories or your eating window at all. That's a time to really beef up your nutrient stores. So that would be another instance if you're trying to get pregnant. I mean, unless you have other hormone issues that we might have time to talk about, but for the most part, if you're wanting to increase fertility, intermittent fasting is probably not for you.
Yeah, I would agree. Still, probably having a 12-hour eating window would make sense. I wouldn't go for a 16-hour eating window, but you don't have to be trying to shrink it into a 6 or an 8-hour or even a 4-hour window like some people do with intermittent fasting. Okay.
And as for the breastfeeding, I mean, when you get that 2 a.m. breastfeed and your husband flips the baby over to you, just don't try and snack on something at that time. Okay. So let's just kind of be a little careful about when you're eating, no snacking. That's still just a good idea. And my patients have always heard me say this a zillion times. Timing is everything. And as long as you're not eating within 3 hours of going to sleep at nighttime, that's another key factor there for anything. So allow your sleep cycle to be that circadian rhythm time period where your physiologic fasting stimulates all those positive things that we've been talking about. And it's just, intermittent fasting is really just a conscious effort to do what should be happening physiologically for our bodies. And so, okay.
Yeah.
That's a really important point, Dr. Mike. Like, that would be the first place to start, in my opinion, if you're a nighttime snacker. Just that window of 3 hours right before bed, so you're done. You go to bed at 9, you're done eating at 6, and that gives your whole circadian rhythm and metabolic processes get ready for that sleep cycle. So that would be if you're like, okay, where do I start? That would be my hands down number one place to start. Beyond that, focus on your 12-hour window. Okay. A lot of us hopefully have that, but you might not, especially if you're a nighttime snacker. So then, move to that 12-hour window. Try that for a week. Maybe the next week you okay, I'm gonna do 14 hours without food, and you just keep restricting until you're feeling like you can handle it, and it'll be it won't be over stressful to your body, especially if you're like in that pre-diabetic and really insulin resistant state. That's going to be a really kind of smooth transition for you as you transition into that as a lifestyle.
And for anybody who hasn't tried it, I intermittent fast pretty much every day now. I do have black coffee in the morning, but if you had told me a few years ago to not eat breakfast every day, I would have looked at you like, you don't know what you're asking. Like, no, it's not even an option. I'd be starving. I would be like, but that's not at all the case. I thought it would be, but it's a lot easier than what I anticipated it being. It took a little bit of an adjustment window, though, to get used to that.
Because you get your insulin sensitivity rises, and you're able to get into that fat burning state quickly. And when you're in a fat burning state, you're not hungry.
Everybody's got built-in snacks of some kind, pretty much across the board. So,
well, I think you're right, Cal. I think one of it is that society has basically dictated that what the word breakfast, right? Break your fast, okay? I mean, so immediately everybody thinks that they need to go and do that, and that's probably not the best bet. There is something called the dawn effect, okay? The dawn effect, which is where when the sunlight does start to rise, your epinephrine levels rise, your growth hormone and your thyroid starts to kick in. So, let that stuff do what it's supposed to do. You don't have to break your fast with an early AM breakfast, but just kind of focus in and avoid the snacking. Those are key things.
Yeah, breakfast is not the most important meal of the day.
Yeah, right.
All the lie that General Mills, I think, and Post and the rest of the makers put out there.
So much for Captain Crunch, huh?
Yeah.
I'll just kind of throw the flip side here too. Maybe you want your eating window to be more towards the morning. Yeah. That's totally fine. I mean, we're talking what works for us and probably what the majority of people do the intermittent fast, but like, if you feel better, like getting up, eating, and then maybe you're done eating by like 3 p.m. and that's just, your windows earlier in the day, you're still going to receive the same benefits.
Yeah.
I think that,
I think maybe the name of it is not good. Intermittent fast. I think the name of it really should just be 8-hour eating, something like that, because that's really what it is. I know somebody asked about 24-hour fasting and things like that. Maybe you guys can talk a little bit about long term. Obviously there are some biblical references to fasting, etc. And so from a spiritual side of things, there are some religions that really propose that. But I'll just say this is that, some of the studies will say if you fast for an extended time period, your hunger starts to build up, you feel grumpy, you just don't feel like yourself. When you're doing these types of 8-hour eating windows, you're not going to feel hungry. You're going to have more, believe it or not, you're going to have more energy, basically because of the mitochondrial effect, like we were just talking about. When you start to go out too long, then you start to use your muscles to break down more things, and you start to get catabolic, and that's what you don't want to be doing in those circumstances. So I wouldn't tell someone to necessarily, again, if you have diabetes, you're in medicine, etc., you shouldn't go for these prolonged types of fasts unless you talk through it with me and you can monitor what's going on. So, okay.
Yeah. I mean, extended fast gets into a whole nother discussion, especially if we're going beyond 24 hours. And it's good. I mean, I've recommended longer fasts to patients before. The longest I've done is a 4-day fast. And I did that because I'm not going to tell a patient to do something that I haven't done myself, because I want to know what it's like. And I felt the same, honestly, day 1 as I did on day 4. I felt the exact same. Hunger, the hunger hormone, ghrelin, does not continue to just rise and rise and rise and rise. It goes away. It increases and then it stops. The brain realizes, hey, I'm not getting anything, so let's move on and keep burning ketones. And so, can do that. But
so there can be some therapeutic benefit, but I think that if you're doing extended fasting, I would work with a practitioner. And we will, maybe we'll address that in another thing. I don't think we're going to get into that here tonight. I did want to answer a question about kombucha. So kombucha would not be a liquid that we would do during fasting, because there still is a sugar component, even though there is, fermented, but there still is, caloric intake there. So that would not be an acceptable
fasting
liquid.
Yeah.
Can you take supplements? Kind of depends on what supplements it is. Sometimes if it might work if you're supposed to take them with food, wait till your eating window to take them. And whoever has like recommended or prescribed those, you might want to, check in with them.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say to that one as well. You know, if you're taking supplements and they're supposed to be with food, just check with the doctor who recommended them to you, and whether that's supplements or medication, either check with the prescribing doctor and they can guide you through if that's appropriate or not.
And I know we're running a little bit out of time, but we did kind of say we were going to at least briefly address hormones, because I know that there's a lot of people that are interested in that. And I just want to say, you know, from a functional and integrative medicine standpoint, if someone presents with a hormone issue, almost every time, one of the first things that comes to my mind, at least, is what is your blood sugar doing? So I want to kind of bring this full circle here. If you find yourself in a place where your hormones are dysregulated and you have a lot of hormone symptoms, I had someone ask about PCOS. Blood sugar is by far my first thing that I'm going to ask you about, and you know, maybe make some, you know, diet and lifestyle changes to kind of help you become a better blood sugar handler. You know, and other things just to consider with hormones. And again, I think this would be a whole talk, but just because I know people wanted to kind of at least have this briefly touched on, I think other things that can contribute to hormone dysregulation would be stress as well. Obviously diet, if you're eating kind of the standard American diet that's super high in sugars and processed foods, you're not going to be a good blood sugar handler. And you're, again, just the way that it's impacted on the gut and the liver function is really going to, you know, mess with your hormones, so to speak. I also would want to consider essential fatty acid status and just where are you consuming fat? I know a lot of women are still fat phobic, and we can't be afraid of fat if we want proper hormone regulation. And just two other things, we would look at gut integrity and liver function, because so many hormone processes are happening in the liver, and as a result of where your gut integrity is, if you have pathogens, if you have a leaky gut, etc. So I know that was super brief, and it really needs a lot more explanation, but since I had those questions come to me today, that's just a little piece of like what some of the factors are that we're looking for. And you can kind of see that it is so intimately related with what we're talking about with blood sugar and fasting that it just deserves to have a real short discussion here.
I'll chime in one last thing, and I agree with Ashley. You know, PCOS, PCOD has a lot to do with insulin resistance, as well as hyperandrogen, too much androgens, too many male hormones, etc. But since you don't drink alcohol, I'll put this out here, because we always leave this out. Don't forget about the effects, the ill effects, the good effects, but the ill effects of alcohol, especially in this circumstance. One of the things a lot of times that people forget is that it's unusable calories. And of course, alcohol is going to raise your triglycerides levels. And you all know what a beer belly looks like, so I won't need to say anything else. Of course, the types of alcohol that you drink may have more carbohydrates in them than other ones as well. So that's also going to be a contributing factor. And again, like Kevin was saying earlier, you know, most of the glucose metabolism happens in and around the liver, between the depositing into the glucagon stores, the glycogen stores, and those hormones. So anything that's going to impact the liver, guess what? Alcohol is going to impact how you metabolize glucose as well too. So you know, there are, again, you know, like we talked about, these are our own personal decisions and our own personal ways to negatively impact our body's metabolism, or positively impacted by some of the things that we're talking about too. Okay.
So I want to open it up to a handful of other questions here. I think we've answered most everything on the list. I know one just came in. It says, what if you have a gallstone and can't consume a lot of fat? So my world, if somebody has a gallbladder that is just full of sludge, has some gallstones, things of that nature, I've seen that resolve personally without having gallbladder removed. You know, I always tell patients there's time and a place for everything. However, we weren't born with spare parts. You know, God didn't make a mistake in how he designed us. Like, that gallbladder does have an important function. It's a storage tank largely for things that the liver makes, etc. And it's critical for breaking down fat as it releases bile and things of that nature. But, you know, there's also a lot of solutions in nature to help deal with things like that. And I'll be honest, like beets, red beets, beetroot is fantastic for starting to break up and almost begin to repair the gallbladder functionality. I use different beetroot extracts and some different tinctures and other capsules, some other enzymatic support. And I have some people who don't have gallbladders in my practice who have absolutely no problem at all consuming fats when they're taking some of these supplements to help make sure they're getting broken down appropriately and are getting through. So, you know, there's options for that. Once again, I would work with your practitioner on your specifics, but, you know, gallstones, really sluggish gallbladder, has a ton of sludge built up into it. It's been seen on some of the studies. That's not a game over. I would say you can fight for your gallbladder here and try to redeem it a little bit with what some of the choices are that are for what's consumed.
Can a gallstone get dissolved? That's a good question. Well, you know, many years ago there were medications to try and do that. It depends on the size of the stone, how many. If you just have one, if it's one large one, if it's multiple stones, etc., or like Dr. Kevin was talking about, whether it's more of a sludge effect. The sludge effect is definitely something that it's much more dietary and supplement driven. You can definitely try and get that to resolve on its own, but it really depends. One large size of gallbladder. That's not going to get broken down by any medicine or anything. So, you know, you just basically have to be careful with your stimuli to gallbladder contraction. Okay. And I think maybe Dr. Ashley can talk a little bit about that with regards to the nutritional things that might, you know, that tend to stimulate that, so that you're not getting so much, the hormone is called CCK, so it doesn't stimulate that gallbladder to contract so much too. But
yeah, I mean, there's a lot to go into with that. I think, yeah, as a whole, that's going to be a tougher thing to look at. It's a good sized stone, so can maybe chat offline about that too if we need to a little bit as well.
Usually when that's the case, then there's something with hyperbilirubinemia. So there's something else that's going on metabolically. So that's why Kevin is saying that. I would say to you to talk to your specific doctor about it as to why you may have formed that, because there are actually some inheritable types of things that could be the root cause for that big of a stone like that too.
Yeah, yeah. What other questions do you all have on intermittent fasting, blood sugar regulation as a whole? Nothing? You guys know it all? You guys can teach the next one. Like I said, I will mention once again for those who joined a little bit later, next week we're going to dive into the world of the thyroid. There is so much thyroid dysfunction. There's a lot of misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis, I would argue, on the thyroid from what I see. And so we're going to be diving into the world of the thyroid. Please share this with other people. If you know people that have thyroid issues or challenges and want to hear about that, that's great. We're just going to continue to be getting on and doing this probably on a weekly basis and sharing about different health topics. So it's kind of fun to touch base with everybody right now since we're all in lockdown. So question.
Yes, automatically. Yep, I have a master list. Got over 100 people. So we are sending those out. I will send the link out the day of, a few hours before, and you should receive it. So once you've received it the first time, I'm just going to keep
people on the list unless they ask to be off.
Exactly. So we will get it for the next week.
I don't know how to respond to the ozone question, quite honestly. I can just tell you that from a standpoint of oxygen, ozone O3, but oxygen we know will certainly help. So by doing your aerobic oxygen-laden exercise, that's going to help to stimulate your muscle contractility, your mitochondrial activity, increasing energy and all that. And of course, that's going to help to lower blood glucose levels. And then over time, also lower your insulin, quote unquote, insulin resistance, but just lower your insulin levels as well, too. But that ozone is outside of mine.
Yeah, honestly, ozone, a lot of functional medicine doctors utilize ozone in their clinics. We don't have that in ours right now. So I personally have not taken a deep dive into the world of ozone to know exactly what all it's doing. So my answer is I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Truly.
I'm glad you brought up exercise, though, because, when you kind of get into this intermittent fasting lifestyle, if you exercise in a fasted state a lot, for me personally, if on good days, I will exercise towards the end of my fasting window. So for me, that's usually around 11 a.m. I'm a homeschooling mom, and I typically, we do our school, I get the girls started on something, and I'm able to work out kind of at the end. And so all those, things, with the mitochondria, human growth hormone, all those things are kind of accelerated, and just the benefits of exercise really in that fasted state. Now, again, talk to somebody, this is kind of, if you do feel like you, have some blood sugar issues, it's not really wise to jump into that. But if you are metabolically flexible, you'll feel great working out in a fasted state. So just, food for thought. That could, again, be a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Ashley. It doesn't have to be high impact,
Right.
et cetera. I mean, you could just be doing a great and a very vigorous yoga program, something like that would be great. You'd be breathing through it. You get your breathing exercise as well. And nowadays, walking. Yeah, I was going to say, getting out and walking around your neighborhood, keeping social distancing with COVID, of course, okay, and wear your mask now, et cetera. But obviously, you want to just get the blood flowing, and that's going to help to lower your blood pressure, and all the other, obviously, the benefits of exercise in general, increasing the blood flow to your brain, more alertness, and getting your cortisol levels. Okay, we won't go into any further, but yeah. So yeah.
No, that's
and
good.
then intermittent fasting on the same days every week. I would say think about your schedule, think about, it really doesn't matter, but it might, some days are just easier to fast than others, but
you don't have to intermittent fast every day either. If you've got for me, when the world was normal, I typically on Fridays, I would take one of my girls on a breakfast date every Friday. That's just what I did. And so guess what? I didn't intermittent fast on Fridays most of the time because I'd be taking them to grab breakfast. And so it doesn't matter. You can bounce around. You can do it 2 days a week. If that's what you can work into your schedule, you can do it 7 days a week. It really doesn't matter either way. Good question, though. I'll say this. I haven't seen any research that would suggest it being good to vary that back and forth or to alter things up that way. Any other questions? Been a good session.
That's good.
Hope you guys all learned a little something about blood sugar and fasting. And once again, a couple of resources if you didn't get them. Jason Fung. I don't get any royalties on these. Obesity Code, Complete Guide to Fasting, and then also Keto Fast by Dr. Joe Mercola. Definitely a little bit of a different take on fasting, but some great concepts too, and is a very interesting read also. So
And actually, Kevin, and we have a really good. There was a really excellent article in the New England Journal of Medicine that was done in December of 2019, just a few months ago. And anybody that goes into NEJM, New England Journal of Medicine, can get 3 issues for free. So you can go experiment it, but it breaks down a lot of things that we just talked about and shows you some other studies, and might even have some of those other little answer or questions that people asked about too. So I totally recommend the books that you just showed, but also there are some general medical literature. So I think you're going to hear more and more and more, hopefully, from your primary care physicians out there as well. And if not, then you need to find you need to ask the right questions. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would agree with you though, Doc.
We have a blog post too that might be helpful in just understanding if you want a free, quick resource.
And this video will hopefully be up on YouTube here at some point by the end of the week. So appreciate everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you for thyroid next week.